Hello and welcome to Coffee with Gish. Today we're geeking out about Mormonism in a very particular way through a theoretical lens. Now, people sometimes get a little bit hot under the collar about theory because it sounds so academic, but depending on the theory, in other words, a sort of mental construct or model that can be used to examine something, you can actually find a lot more clarity of thought by adopting a theoretical perspective on something. Today we're going to focus on this idea of lived religion. It's a theory about religion that's come up in divinity schools, academic departments of religious study, that looks at the lives of people and their religious practices as they actually do them. Now, that's a really simple idea, but it's also, oddly enough, a kind of revolutionary approach to the study of religion. Because instead of taking big groups who identify themselves by their association with a particular group or community, scholars who take the approach of lived religion are actually going to people and examining their personal lives and how they live their spirituality, their religious and cultural ideas on the ground. And what you find when you look at what people actually do as opposed to the labels they apply to themselves or others apply to them when they go out to study Presbyterians or Hindus or Muslims or atheists, is they really see that labels have a very limited value in actually understanding what it is that people do. So how does this look on the ground? Well, what you find is that a person may say, "Oh, I'm Catholic," but then they're doing all kinds of other interesting things that the label of Catholic wouldn't really capture. Labeling something really kind of stops our examination on a certain level. We end up looking through a lens that the label provides, and we judge everything according to our assumptions about or people's particular definitions of a label. So lived religion, on the other hand, says, okay, so this person is Catholic, but if I go and talk to them and see how they live their lives, their Catholicism includes Stoic philosophy. Their Catholicism evidently includes following their horoscope. All kinds of different things. So what we find if we examine the lives of individual people, how they live, what we're finding is that even though they apply particular labels to themselves, in practice, they're not really limited in their religious, spiritual beliefs and practices by that label, by that community that they associate with. The label Mormon doesn't necessarily capture everything that's connected to this tradition of religious community practice and belief that springs from the prophetic career of Joseph Smith Jr. in the 1820s through 1840s. Mormons, individual Mormons, can believe and do a lot of interesting things. And I can tell you by my personal experience in Mormonism that in some ways Mormons are very open to sort of potpourri cafeteria, it's often called cafeteria style approach to religion. And that can seem odd because on the one hand, for decades, probably since the mid to late 20th century career of Bruce R. McConkie, the apostle who wrote the infamous tome Encyclopedia, as it were, Mormon Doctrine, there's been this idea that purity of doctrine is important, very important in Mormonism. And you can trace that viewpoint back to certain things that Joseph Smith, for example, said, the founder of the religion. He felt it was important to understand who God is. And I think people have taken that to mean that if our beliefs about God are wrong, for example, from a Mormon perspective, if you believe a standard creedal Trinitarian view of Christianity, well, then you're on the wrong track, because it's only through the restoration that we get to know that God is a person who has an immortal body, who's a resurrected being, a perfected being, etc., etc. Lots of things that we don't have time to get into now. But there's this idea that, okay, the doctrines define what the religion is, and it's important to maintain a purity of doctrine if you're not going to go off on the wrong path, miss your chance at exaltation and eternal progression, and all these things that Mormons strive for. And yet, Joseph Smith is also the source of the idea that all truth can be circumscribed into one great whole, and that truth is out there in the world to find. And really, that's kind of how Joseph Smith encountered the ideas of the Restoration that he felt inspired to put together in Mormonism itself. It's responding spiritually to certain true principles that he brought into the faith. That's kind of what Mormonism is about. So Mormonism is really strange in this way. It seems very limiting, and there are certain personalities that really latch onto this idea of the importance of true doctrine and probably have very specific ideas about what true doctrine is. But then there's this sort of, I don't know, almost New Age-y. I know New Age has a kind of a bad connotation for many people, but it's a very open and holistic idea that Mormonism is really open, and it's a search for truth. And so I think this makes Mormons almost seem contradictory in a way, that they're really convinced that they found the truth in Mormonism, and yet Mormonism is telling them to go out and seek for truth and find truth wherever you can. Okay, and this really, so you'll meet some interesting Mormons out there who believe a lot of unusual things, at least in contrast with what you may assume. Why is it that this Mormon that I know is really interested in, medieval mystics? Or why is this particular Mormon I know really interested in astrology and the occult? Or why is this Mormon here celebrating Jewish festivals? Now, I bring up those things not as complete hypotheticals. I bring them up as examples that I could actually put names to. And so you can't really, and this is odd, because the image of the Mormon is almost like this, sort of stereotypical pasty white, straight-laced, sort of boring business middle-class person that, might annoy you by, delivering fresh bread to you and asking you to read the Book of Mormon, which you probably, if you tried reading, would find incredibly boring. I'm sorry, but that's probably how you would react. And yet, I think Mormonism, in my experience growing up, was one of the most strange, unusual, and unexpected experiences that that you could have religiously, because it doesn't really reflect the stereotype that well. Is there something behind the stereotype? Absolutely, absolutely. And there are those people who, I would say the sort of aspirational business class Bruce R. McConkie type of person. And we could pull apart those labels and show how problematic they are, but there is something to that. And at the same time, there are Mormons out there who are interested and curious and incorporating all kinds of things into their spiritual lives. And lived religion, if we were to look at Mormonism through the lens of lived religion, that variety is what we would see. We wouldn't see the sort of two-dimensional stereotypes that people bring to the topic when they talk about Mormonism. And I would say that aspect of the religion has really always been there. You can read the work of one of my favorite Mormon historian, Stephen Fleming, who talks about, and he's not the only one, there are others out there who do, but he's the one I know best, about seekerism. They're in the approaches one could have to Christianity in early United States, in the post-Revolutionary War period. One of the approaches that you could have to Christianity is very much the Protestant, Bible-based, sola scriptura approach to religious faith through a sort of set community or church. But then there's this other movement that was much more nebulous and flexible called seekerism, where people didn't want to be hemmed in by particular churches with their creeds and doctrines. And I hope this starts to sound familiar, because Joseph Smith's family was interested in seekerism. There were seeker members of the Smith family. Their relatives that they knew very well. And you might say that Joseph Smith Jr.'s father, Joseph Smith Sr., was very influenced by things like seekerism and universalism. And oddly enough, Joseph Smith founds a church that maintains that sort of, in a way, I'm not going to say that it's an ideal happy land of anything goes, but that spirit of seeking for truth that comes partly out of seekerism and partly, I'm sure, out of Joseph Smith's own brilliant mind, inspiration, connection with the divine, etc., that it's still there. And it makes Mormonism, as it's practiced, a lot more interesting. It makes it not the two-dimensional stereotype that people imagine it is very often, or that people attack. But, this is true of everyone. I don't want to just say, oh, this is just Mormonism, it's just Mormons, it's just religious people. Individual people are complicated, and if there was a larger message I'd like to convey that might have some salutary effect on those who watch this video, it would be that the people in your life are complicated, and their politics, their personal views, their religious practices and ideas, the way they see the world, the way they think about science, they're not so easily pigeonholed, and people will surprise you. I just want to close by saying lived religion. Scholars like David Hall, Robert Orsi, Meredith McGuire was actually the first scholar I read who introduced me to the concept. She wrote a book on lived religion that was published in 2008. You can find it on Amazon. I say give it a look and, really think about what religious identity means and does not mean, because religious identity is, we usually talk about it statistically, demographically, and in the assumptions we make about others. It's not really capturing who people are, what they do, and what they actually believe. So anyhow, this has been Coffee with Kish. Thanks for spending some time with me. Please like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.